What other company do you really sort of admire and respect in terms of their philosophy and approach to acquisitions and business development and growth?
I think Intuitive has a strategy and sticks with their strategy. They are leading from the front. I think Edwards Lifesciences, as an observer of the TAVR market and now the mitral valves and some of these other areas, they've done consistent and smart acquisitions.
I don't believe in decisions by committee. I don't think anything good was done by committee. I'll give you a great example of that. Google Gemini is a great AI product. It's fantastic. But if you look at the way they've rolled it out, it's like an example of what happens when you do product launches by committee. When it comes to acquisition targets, what's more important is to be a very meaningful, specific for a niche market and have traction there. Too many med device companies take this farmer approach, which they're trying to like everything for anybody, and it's just the wrong idea.
You can't replace part of the brain.
Like, you treat them the same.
Source of truth for the MedTech industry.
Coexists with the prophets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the MedTech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the $90 billion company. They had help up high, a lot of things.
State of MedTech with your host, Omar M. Khatib.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's guest came on my radar mainly because, for one, there's a lot of very new and interesting roles in the space, specifically around acquisitions and strategy and growth. Brent Lavin is the director of strategic growth over at BD, where he spearheads the development of comprehensive growth strategies by, very specifically like identifying and evaluating like high potential opportunities for both organic development and targeted acquisitions that, essentially are going to unlock growth opportunities and achieve revenue goals. That being said, before we sort of talk shop and jump into it, today's episode in no way, shape, or form reflects any position or opinion that BD has, but Brent is here, not a representative of the company, but again, that is where he works. So Brent, that being said, thank you so much for coming on the show to kind of, share more about your experience and, more importantly, give lessons to people, because I know there's a lot of BD and marketing people who want to move into this kind of position, but there's not really a course or anything on how do you do that. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad to be part of this, and I'm continuing to learn. So hopefully we can talk about some great ideas and we can learn from the audience as well.
Totally. And, maybe before we talk shop, give us a little intro on yourself. Who is Brent Lavin? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? How did you get into MedTech? Maybe spend a minute or two on that.
I love that. Thanks for asking the question. I grew up in small town USA in Wisconsin. And back in the day, I wrote one paper application to go to the University of Wisconsin. And I was good at math and science. So I checked the engineering box because that's what you did. And I knew I could be successful at that. So when I got to campus, I was just exploring and ended up deciding to do electrical engineering, primarily because I liked making things. I liked innovation. I liked technical product development. And so I bounced around a little bit and in integrated circuits, and then eventually ended up doing a design engineering role in Wisconsin. But that's really where I kind of quickly pivoted towards MedTech. I was about 6 months into my job, and I had been having years of consistent abdominal problems. I went into the ER on a Saturday night in just terrible pain. They did a CT scan, and it immediately identified what the issue had been. So I was sitting in the surgeon's office on Monday morning with, the axial images spread out on a CT, and this doctor said, "You need to be in surgery in 4 days, and this is what we're going to do." And instead of being scared or in denial, I was fascinated. I was fascinated that this 15-minute scan had identified what had been going on. And I really decided kind of then and there, I need to do that. And I had been on the engineering side, but I didn't really love it. But I liked working with customers. And so I wanted to bridge that gap between engineering and the commercial side. So I went back and got my MBA and joined GE Healthcare because that was right in our backyard. And I loved my experience at GE Healthcare in the imaging space. So I worked with a lot of global companies or global partners in product development and launches. And to just wrap that up, I ended up coming over to Arizona 14 years ago with CR Bard, which was then eventually bought by BD. And I've spent nearly 20 years in product management, innovation, helping teams identify, execute, and then launch the next innovation in MedTech across a variety of disease states.
I love it. And again, like what sort of stood out to me, that's why I reached out and wanted to have you on the show, is that, you've been in like marketing leadership roles, product management roles, and more specifically, like at, very large established companies with multi-billion-dollar divisions, so it's, not something that's commonly seen. So I'm very happy that
Yeah.
you came on the show. My first question to you kind of to start is, for me being a startup guy, we have a marketing agency. We work with a lot of startups, not only to raise money, but how do you position yourself to get commercial traction and get acquired? Why do some companies choose, let's say, to build a new capability organically while
Yeah.
others opt to buy and then, make that decision?
Yeah, it's a complex question, obviously, and each company is different. But I would start with kind of looking at three characteristics from the company side is, are we in that disease state? Are we currently treating that patient population? Do we have the technical capabilities to build what we think we need to build in order to solve the problem? And then the third piece is, do we have that call point and the commercial scale in order to be successful there? If it's a checkbox on all three of those, we should really be building that. It is going to be the least expensive, and we're going to have the most control over it by the time we come to market. But when you don't have all three of those, you really need to supplement and look at the buy option. Clearly, that's going to be more expensive, but it's also a much quicker time to market. And I would say of those three, the most successful that I've seen are areas where the company, the strategic, has the disease state and the call point / commercial scale in place, and they're looking to supplement with the technical side of it. And then we bring that into the portfolio, we gain the technical capability, and then we can bring that to market. Now, we could talk all day long about what stage of that process and the technical risk is the company willing to take, but that's generally how I would look at it.
And then for you at BD, what specific, I guess, specialties or disease states do you personally look at?
Yeah, so my current role is in the vascular side of the business. So we are doing peripheral vascular and ESKD, end-stage kidney disease, arterial and venous interventions. So I just like to say legs and arms, everything but the head and heart.
Got it. It's an exciting space as well. There's a lot of really interesting innovation there.
Mhm.
When it comes to your portfolio over at BD and your commercial roadmap, like when you look at companies, like what are some like specific factors you consider when you're evaluating whether a target company actually fits that portfolio?
Yeah, in addition to those kind of three characteristics I mentioned before, I'm trained in the biodesign process. And so I would be looking to say, is this solving a significant problem for a specific and sufficient population size? And are we able to demonstrate it with an outcome that is demonstrable to clinicians, right? And so are we solving a problem for a population? And then can we demonstrate that in an outcome? And that's what when we're looking at these startups and early stage companies, those are the things we're looking for. We're not generally looking for another widget within an already crowded category necessarily. Now, there are times that might be desirable, but typically we want to be advancing care and making something that's significant and then, demonstratable through clinical data.
Yeah, not to mention that, acquisitions and mergers are very messy and costs a lot of time and money. And so if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that like you've optimized for the upside, I think probably, I wonder if you can think of for all the Stryker people, I got love for you, but like, I was gonna say, I don't know if you can think of a more messier one. But I think like when Stryker acquired Mako, Kevin Lobo and his team turned that into a phenomenal area that they unlocked growth. But like the first few years, that acquisition and merger was very, very difficult. Like in terms of integrating it within the company and everything, they went through a lot of tough times. And I think just that alone affected the robotic acquisition market. But, would you say, is there like another use case of like an example of like, hey, like this is why you want to optimize for like true value to be unlocked because it could take a lot of time and money, et cetera, like Mako?
Yeah, I'm going to answer in a slightly different because every acquisition and path is different. And so because we've gone through this, we've learned specific lessons in each case that we apply on the next one. So it is a bit of a cumulative effect. And so to the degree that everyone is different, I think your degree of experience over time helps inform that next one. And the thing that I would probably focus in on is there's always a difference between the early adopters and the people that are able to make the technology work in a hospital setting when they have all kinds of time and great assistance or 20 years of experience. But bridging that chasm then to the ASC, OBL, where they have less time, less assistance, maybe just less experience, you've got to be able to cross that chasm. So that's the thing I would pay attention to, is not necessarily in addition to the internal pieces of it, the external piece of trying to cross that to the broader market.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you look at, I guess, your career at BD, like at least something that's public, and feel free, you can
Yeah.
hard pass on this, but what's in at least public knowledge and everything. Can you give an example of, a specific and like real acquisition that happened, like what made it compelling and maybe what happened, what may have surprised you during the integration?
Yeah, so I would say, and this is public information, we did buy a company in Switzerland in 2020, right at the cusp of COVID. And they had an atherectomy and a thrombectomy system that had been in use in Europe for 15 or 20 years. And so they had gained FDA approval, but they didn't have the commercial scale. So we were plugging that into our sales organization. And there was a lot of learnings there, but I think we were ultimately successful because we solved an unmet need in the market, and that the Rotarex system was really a combination of atherectomy and thrombectomy together in a way that no other product satisfied that need. And then we learned a lot through training those physicians, as I mentioned before, in just the nuances of how to use the product. It was not necessarily like a product that had been on the market before. And so we needed to take our time and really in service accurately and do a lot of physician training to make sure that they were familiar with it. And that's been a great success for us because we were able to find an unmet need in the market and then satisfy it with this device.
Got it. And during that period, like, was there anything that may have surprised you? Like, I always wonder, like, when it comes to these acquisitions, you go through this period of due diligence, et cetera.
Yeah.
You make the acquisition, and then, maybe there's something you find out that you wouldn't have found out no matter what you did during due diligence. You find out post acquisition. Like, what are those
Yeah.
things usually?
Yeah, I think some of those things, I would say they're always bound to happen. We've all bought a house, right? And we've done the house inspection, and you think you know what you're getting, but then, the faucet starts to leak the day after you buy it. And so those things are inevitable, and you got to be ready for those. I would maybe answer in two ways. One of which is that chasm I talked about before, going from the early adopters and the KOLs to the rest of the physicians out there and trying to scale that. That's something that is hard to replicate during due diligence. And then I would say, just globally, our supply chains in MedTech are really stressed post COVID, and they continue to be stressed. And those are things that were macro shocks that we couldn't plan for. And so those are things that you just need to be ready and adapt, because no diligence is completely perfect.
Yeah, I think that's it's actually a great analogy. We just bought a house this past year, and we went through the same thing. Like, everything on the inspection report checked out amazing, but then once we moved in, we're like, oh, this is not good. We got to change this, etc. So yeah, it's funny how that goes. And I think, what's funny is, like, going on that same analogy, like the next house we buy, there's all kinds of things that are in my mind where I'm like, I'm going to make sure I check this and that. So like at a place like not just BD, but anywhere, you mentioned that your thesis on a previous acquisition, you do, like, let's say, an after action review or post-mortem and build on that. Is there like a internal document, or I guess these days, I mean, with all these LLMs from ChatGPT, et cetera, is there a GPT or AI that you guys are training on some of these insights? Or how do you make sure that that knowledge base kind of continues to build and it's distributed across the team?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I think it's something that we're always trying to build is, the tribal knowledge, so to speak. And so I would say that, we do work hard on processes and systems to build that into the next deal. But at the same time, there will be a hiccup that you can't anticipate. And I think that's one of the things that I've loved about MedTech is that the people here, I mean, I have 14 years at BD, and I often sit in the room with the least amount of experience. People stay in these roles and they stay in this industry, and that is exceedingly important regardless of the AI and the GPTs that we have out there, because that is institutional knowledge that just builds on itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what's always important is that when people get promoted or they leave and transfer companies and everything, like how do you like sustain that
Mm.
knowledge going forward and just doesn't sort of die with that person, right? Where do you feel like the best ideas and innovations like come from? Like how do you separate
Yeah.
what, let's say, physicians say from what they actually need? I think that's always
Yeah.
like an
I'm so
important thing.
glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that. So I would first of all say that it starts with great physician relationships. We all have to have a Rolodex of people that we can trust and can text and call and rely on for information that are on the cutting edge of how procedures are changing or how patients are changing, referral patterns. But we also spend a lot of time watching cases. And you brought it up. There's often a difference between what they say they do and what they actually do. And so we as independent people can take notes and look for those things. And oftentimes the physician may have a super easy time with the case, but the tech at the back table is really struggling to get that balloon onto the wire, or they had to change wires. And the doctor didn't really bother the doctor, but the tech is really struggling with it. So looking for these other things that are going on, or they can't correlate images to, that there's these unmet needs that they don't even know they have by just watching cases. I would also say, journal articles and conferences are great ways, just talking with people that you can bring ideas from another industry, even from surgical robots into endovascular or vice versa. And then the last one I wanted to say is just also the post-market feedback is
Hmm.
super critical, because you may not be able to do anything immediately if it's a PMA product, but you might be able to build that into the next product that comes along. So just because the program is launched and out in the market doesn't mean you stop innovating.
Got it. When you kind of look at, because I'm sure all you BD guys like follow each other, but I'm wondering like if you're at BD, you're there for a reason, you love it. So you can't pick BD. When you look in the market, what other company do you really sort of admire and respect in terms of their philosophy and approach to acquisitions and business development and growth? If there's a company and or like individuals, because this is an area that we're trying to cover more on the show, so I'm always interested to
Yeah,
hear.
I would point out too, and I think these are probably at the top of the list and obvious, is I think Intuitive has a strategy and sticks with their strategy, and
Hmm.
they are leading from the front and continuing to push the boundaries far out in front of where the competitors are. But I'd also point out, I think Edwards Life Sciences, as an observer of the TAVR market and now the mitral valves and some of these other areas, again, they have a strategy and they've done consistent and smart acquisitions throughout the years that have continued to expand their TAM and make them competitive in these growing and emerging areas where other startups are really innovating.
Well, of the strategics that are out there that do acquisitions, is there one that kind of stands out that actually does succeed, when it comes to their approach to do things organically and build? Because at least for me, like on the surface, if someone asks me like which strategic does a great job of in-house innovation and building from scratch, like not a lot of them, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of risk, and there's something to be said that when you're in a startup with limited resources and of course as a product guy, like you'll appreciate this, constraints, right?
Yeah.
You have bureaucratic constraints in like large strategic organizations, but you don't have like financial time constraints, all these other things that really force you to innovate. Is there a strategic out there that does a good job of like building from within?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that having nearly 20 years in the industry, it's changed a lot in terms of who's doing the true innovation. And I think you hit on it, is that strategics, what I see today, are doing less and less organic innovation and more inorganic. I'm super proud of what BD has done in the peripheral intervention business, where we have a real strength in drug device combination products with our drug coated balloons, as well as covered stents and stents in general, nitinol and EPTFE. And so we're always looking for ways to combine those and apply them. And we've got some things that are public, information, where we're combining those in interesting ways to push the treatment of of PAD forward. And that's based on our technical expertise and our long history there. It's a good question. I do think we're going to see, more acquisitions than not in
I
the
hope so.
in the next year. And that's why I'm excited to leverage, my product marketing together with my inorganic experience in shaping the portfolio for this business going forward.
Yeah, and like just on the acquisition market in general, like the former head of the FTC, Lena Khan, is ending her reign, and she was really, really heavy on antitrust and mergers and acquisitions. We just didn't see. I mean, forget about MedTech. Just in general, the
Yeah.
M&A markets have not been good the last few years, and so I'm hoping that M&A starts to heat up. And especially, I feel like I'm seeing a lot of strategics since last year spin out some of their lower revenue performing divisions. And so I think that also makes sense in terms of them making room for acquisitions that make sense. We've seen Stryker and J&J this year make a lot of acquisitions. So I'm pretty excited. I think it's also good for the industry because for investors and investments to come in, investors want to know that, hey, there's an actual pathway for us to get a return, and we're not going to be doing this for 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I actually think that you bring up the divestitures that there's been probably 6 that I can think of over the last 6 months or 9 months that have been announced. And I do think that creates some good focus for the companies, both sides of the companies. And then it provides room for these startups because there are points sometimes where the company becomes too big and too diverse. And it's hard for a startup to gain traction with a company like BD because it's just so large.
And, on that note, like something I want to sort of demystify with you is that, when the sort of the table stakes that are obvious is like you have a device, it works, it's got some patents, right? But I think there's some other things that are really important when it comes to being a good acquisition target. Like you have good commercial systems in place, you have a good brand, you have some kind of process and a really good CRM. Like all these things, I believe, make a difference. But I'm wondering from your perspective, like what commercial factors, like whether it's scale, Salesforce readiness, the CRM, the brand, et cetera, all these things, what commercial factors come into play when you're looking at a potential acquisition?
Yeah, I'm going to bring up 2 things. The one of which is, and you hit on it, is the sales process. Does the company have a well thought out demo, adoption, or retention plan? And do they have analytics around what portion of the market they've approached, what their close rate is, and how they maintain that customer retention over time? So I think that's one piece of it that becomes increasingly important. The other thing I'll bring up is the global regulatory landscape is significantly different post MDR than it was pre MDR. And a lot of startups in the past could focus on US approval and then allow the strategic to take it globally. And I think we're increasingly looking for a startup to have at least considered how to gain the MDR certification and approval in other regions. Now, it's not that they have to have done it, but they've had to have built the systems and be ready to be able to do that. And there's not a barrier in place.
What does that mean when you say build the systems?
The design process controls, to have factored it into their IDE study, if they need to have European or Asian patients within the study, to have the quality system that could be adopted by MDR or other countries. It's not just MDR, it's becoming increasingly fragmented across the globe. Canada has new regulations, Japan, China. And so having some understanding and plan for how to bring this out globally is becoming increasingly imperative.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And I think what's interesting is that it used to be that getting like CE marking was a little bit easier in the past, and you still, have this battle test ground clinically, commercially in Europe, and then you get ready for the US. But now like MDR and CE marking is becoming a lot more difficult. And so a lot of companies are just skipping that and coming straight to the US.
Yeah, and that's definitely a consideration. I'll say the first 2 or 3 PMA products that I launched in the last decade, were on the market in Europe. So we could go over and we could watch cases, we could talk to doctors, we could find out what they liked and didn't like. And that gave us a lot of advanced information in order to launch in the US. And now that is flipped. We're often launching in the US first and then in Europe, usually 1 quarter, sometimes 2 quarters later. It's definitely a different landscape and something that needs to be taken into account.
I think the other key when it comes to like strategic acquisitions is making sure that you get ahead of it early enough before like competition, right? Because like when something's got sort of hitting the hockey stick curve and they have like double digit growth in revenue, then it becomes an obvious acquisition. The problem though is that now you're in a bidding war with like competitors and everything. What are some like early signals that you guys look for, whether it's like clinically at conferences, digitally online, that make you say, okay, we need to tag this company and keep an eye out on them. We should get engaged like earlier, like from now.
Yeah, so I would say that it starts with our strategy, which is what are the areas, and I mentioned disease states earlier, is it in our core disease state and an adjacency that we look to build upon, right? And so if it's 3 steps down the road, we're probably not paying as close attention. But if it's one adjacency over that we're interested in getting into, we're definitely talking to doctors and we're finding out what is the technology that they're most interested in and what problems are they looking to solve. And so it really starts with our strategy, and then we bolt on the technology and the company after that. We also have at our company innovation days, and where people do journal reviews and they talk about various things that are in the journals well before they're hitting, preclinical data. And so that can be an area that, we look at pretty closely.
Got it. One of the other acquisitions that I know that you were part of, I believe, was Venclose, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you walk us through a little bit, like about like how they came on your radar and like how did you evaluate them?
Yeah. So I'm going to sound like the old guy, but when I started, it was peripheral arterial disease, and our venous business was frankly an IVC filter, and not really your traditional venous disease as we think about today. And we saw this trend in the early 2010s and started to design the Venovo venous stent. So the Venovo venous stent was the first FDA approved device in 2017. And that really started to build our venous business. And so when I talked about adjacencies, we were starting to split off venous as a disease state and then looking for those adjacencies. And so we had the deep venous stenting covered with the valve. We obviously had the IVC filter. Well, what's the next obvious adjacencies? It was insufficient veins, chronic venous insufficiency. And at the time, thermal was the dominant player, and there was the laser device and then the Medtronic device, and then Venclose was the startup. And so we, again, frankly, became interested because a doctor was using it, and a doctor was involved in their trial. And because of our close relationships with that doctor, he said, you really need to take a look at this. And then we said, okay, that's a great adjacency, and it's got a value proposition of the dual heating length, and there was other factors, and the rest they say is history. And so within about 12 months of identifying it, we had gone through the entire process of early identification, diligence, and a close on that deal.
Interesting. Yeah. And it's helpful, to share this. And I really appreciate you coming on and talk about this because, when we see the headlines, I mean, there's always only so much you can read about that, but it's interesting to hear it from your perspective in terms of what you're specifically looking for. We've talked a lot about like criteria that you look for and how you evaluate, but I'm wondering like in the past, without like naming company names, but just
Sure.
like, if you can give us some variables, like what were some things that made you interested in a company and then turned into like you identifying some red flags and you say, okay, not a good target for us. We should not acquire this company.
Yeah, I would say that, and I'm going to talk generally, that
Yeah,
I think
generally.
I think the biggest gap that I've seen in my experience is, you can make one product, you can make 100 products, and you can even do an IDE, but can you scale that and hit the cost target that a strategic would need in order to make, the margin expectations? And so that's, I think, where a lot of the, again, in my experience, these things fall apart. It's not in the experience of the physician or the results they get. Is it generalizable and is it scalable? to the place, and can we make a sufficient margin on it that meets our business needs?
That makes sense. So on that topic, like I have kind of a controversial question to ask. I mean, you've been a product leader and stuff. I'm wondering how you feel. There's always this gap between having a single product owner or no more than 2 or 3 versus a team or committee doing it. Do you believe like having a single product owner who sees the product through from concept to commercial launch is important? What's your stance on that? How do you think about that?
Yeah. And so I started my MedTech career at GE, as I mentioned, and we had a separate upstream and downstream silo. And there was no single product owner in my experience. And that was a gap. And I wanted the experience of owning both upstream and downstream together. And that's ultimately one of the value propositions. And the reason I moved my family to Arizona to join Bard was because I could do both. And so I spent a lot of my product management career doing both upstream and downstream. And I believe that that is the best kind of way to do it because of the product ownership. To your point, I do think it's becoming more and more complex today. And I think you need to have some specialized skills in each one of those. But ultimately, I think you need to join them together with one product owner who kind of sees the entire field and can act from cradle to grave across that product ownership. And I think when we start to split those responsibilities, it gets really hard to meet objectives.
Yeah, I agree. And personally, I mean, I think like at massive companies, it makes sense you want to divide those things out. But I always felt like it's important to know both extremely well. Even if, let's say, you're in an upstream role or downstream role, I feel like it's important to understand both those things. We've gotten to a point in our industry where there are certain companies where the upstream product marketers or product managers have no concept nor appreciation for commercializations. And I think that's a huge problem because you can't, you can have the best product in the world, but if you don't understand how you're going to actually drive the adoption of it, it doesn't make sense,
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, there can be some specialization at periods of time, right? But I actually think you need to develop your ideal user at the time of the business proposal, at the time of the requirement specification. You need to already be thinking about the brochure. You need to be thinking about the segmentation strategy. You need to think about how you're going to bring that to market. Now, some things might shift, but having done downstream for periods of my career, I think I'm better at then going to the upstream portion.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, how do you think about when it comes to like commercialization, why is it important for the product leader to start thinking about that from like day zero?
So I think you need to know how these users, these ultimate buyers behave and how they're going to respond to your offering. And so I think you need to even think about their motivations, whether they're in a hospital and the employed physician at a hospital versus the owner of an OBL ASC. And those are two very different sets of users. And if you're trying to design for both, you're ultimately going to make a trade-off and a compromise and may satisfy neither one of them. So to the degree that you understand your go-to-market strategy, you can make the smart choices in the product design phase so that you'll be successful in the end. I want to tell a story from my original product development days as an engineer. I was with a contract engineering company and I was doing the electrical design and we had a whole cross-functional team. And we were working for a group of scientists that owned a patent on a blood culturing technology, but they didn't have an engineering team, so we were designing it. And every time we came to them and say, do you want A or B, specification, they said, we'll do both. Because there was some software involved, so they were like, well, just make it optional. And it became optional, optional, optional. And at the end, it became overly complex. And we really struggled to get this thing across the finish line because the verification validation was so complicated. And it wasn't designed for anybody. It was designed for everybody. And I just had that epiphany that they didn't have a view of what the customer wanted. And I knew that I was good at making trade-offs and working with the customer. And so I think that's what's helped me be successful in my role is I understand you can't get everything. So you're going to have to make some trade-offs. Now, there are some things that are non-negotiable, but if you've got two features, you may have to give up one in order to get it across the finish line. So a product manager has to understand the psyche of the end user to know which of those are non-negotiable and which of them they can compromise on.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep, like that you mentioned that. I think that's part of being a good product leader, is knowing like that you're going to have to make really hard decisions and which ones are worth taking the bet on. This is why, like, again, you can't do it at larger companies, but like smaller companies, I don't believe in decisions by committee. I don't think anything good was done by committee. I'll give you a great example of that. Google Gemini is a great product, their AI product. It's fantastic. Okay. But if you look at the way they've rolled it out, it's like an example of what happens when you do product launches by committee, where like, I'm getting like recommendations to use it in my Gmail and all these different places. It's just like not a good rollout. And meanwhile, it's just this amazing product, right? And I feel like great product leaders, like they really just own the product, even to the point where it's commercialization, where maybe it's not necessarily your responsibility, but you're still like deeply involved with the direction of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think the best people that I've worked with in MedTech are deeply committed. They've been there in the lab where they saw the idea generated, and then they've seen that process play out, sometimes over several years, and then they stay because they want to see this launch and be tied all the way across the whole process.
Like on the topic of launch strategies, I'm
Yeah.
wondering like, how does one of the other shifts that we've seen in the market over the last like definitely 10 years, it's probably a little bit longer, but definitely in the last 10 years, the shift from in like decision making power from back in the good old days when I was dumb in high school and not working for Intuitive Surgical. Back then, the surgeon, the clinician had the power to say, I'm adopting this technology, and the hospital buys it. But now we've shifted away from that to a lot more influenced by value analysis committees. Like, how do you feel that impacts the way a company thinks about commercial readiness and launch strategies? I feel like there's still this element where you have to target getting like a strong clinical adopter and advocate, but then you have to have a larger, more sophisticated approach of like, how are we going to get this through, the VAC committee?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important, and something again that I think should be baked in as early as possible, because value analysis committee cannot be an afterthought, because you need time to develop those materials, primarily the health economics and outcomes research materials that more and more value analysis committees are expecting. When devices are going to cost 2x or 3x more than the incumbent, they're going to expect that there's demonstrable clinical value. And the piece I would say is, oftentimes, if you plan early enough, you can get secondary or observational data points out of your IDE study for free that can then be baked into your HER materials. But if you don't do it at the front end, you're never, when you're building the SAP and building all the case report forms, you're never going to get it out of the back end. And you definitely need to be thinking about that early on and who's involved, because the value analysis committee is frankly a gatekeeper in many organizations now in a way that it wasn't, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. On the topic of like, let's say go to market, I'm going to throw kind of a curveball here at you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really big on, again, being a founder and a startup guy. There's a Pareto in everything. For those who are not familiar, the Pareto law of like 80-20. I think it's more extreme in real life. Like it's more like 90-10 or 99-1. But if we just stick to like the Pareto people are used to, which is the 80-20, if you like had to build a GTM plan for a device company tomorrow with a small budget, what's your 80-20 play? And I'm going to leave it sort of open-ended there, and you go in any direction you want.
Yeah, I love this question because we have more data today than we've ever had in my career, and it'll only continue to grow. And so I will say, I'll name a tool. We have access to the AcuityMD tool that many companies have, but it's been game-changing for us in terms of segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And so if I were at a small company, I would try to get as specific as possible with my segmentation strategy to know who's my ideal target. And so am I looking for vascular surgeons that own their own OBL, that may be trained at these 20 institutions and have 10 years more or more of experience, and they also do aortic repair, endovascular EVAR. like I'm just making that up, but I'm trying to get as specific as possible so that I can get a really hyper targeted list of potential users. And that's where I would start. And I would be using, again, all the tools, LSI, AcuityMD, our internal sales tools, anything that I could get my hands on.
Yeah, there's some really amazing tools. AcuityMD is really good. The one that I end up using is Alpha Sophia.
Yep.
So I love Alpha Sophia. Shameless plug for those who want to get a really good, not just demo, but I think they give you a free report or two. You can go to alphasophia.com/Omar. What's going on, everybody? Quick commercial break. Now, whether you're a sales or marketing leader in MedTech, let's be honest, when you think about your reps who are out in the field, they're spending a lot of time not selling, like literally not selling. And the reason why that's happening is because our industry is really outdated when it comes to sales enablement and sales excellence. Think about what your reps are actually doing if you really ask them. They're spending time updating the CRM, juggling administrative tasks, searching for the right piece of content before they talk to a surgeon. They're literally at a disadvantage, and it doesn't have to be this way. That's not selling. It's literally just friction getting in the way of revenue. This is why I've personally partnered up with Showpad for over the past year. You've heard me talk about them before on the show. Showpad is the first AI-powered revenue effectiveness platform built for complex field selling. It brings together things like content, readiness, collaboration, and intelligence all in one place. So you understand things like which piece of content is actually having the most impact and effect, and more importantly, how you can automate things so that sellers can focus on selling. Sellers can instantly find the right content with AI search, sharpen their pitches with AI roleplay, which is really cool to see, and even build digital mutual action plans that stay in sync with buyers and accelerate deal cycles. Deal velocity and pipeline velocity is everything. Showpad really helps that. So all this context essentially goes back and fuels Showpad's intelligence layer, surfacing insights and the next best steps to help sellers close deals faster. So if you're interested to learn more, go to showpad.com/state of medtech, and you can learn more there. Now, let's get back to the episode. The LSI dashboard, their market intel is amazing. I use it for the show all the time. I'm a big fan of that. There's a new one that was started by 2 reps called let me see. This is great for sales, by the way. Oh God, I'm okay here. Yeah, now I wanted to make sure it's repprep.ai. So these 2 guys, Brandon and Eddie, former reps, developed this with a technical founder out of Silicon Valley. So essentially, salespeople could plug into this. They'll put in their brochures, etc., and then this will build a sales plan, not just targeting any physician, but specifically in their geography, who's the right physicians to target, and it'll give them, based on all these training models and sales strategies, like what the positioning is, what they should talk to the physician about, like literally every single thing. And I think that's like the key to winning in sales is what are you going to do in your daily activity? And so there's like amazing tools. Just imagine if you and I had ChatGPT 10 years ago, how much easier our jobs would have been.
Yeah, it really is amazing. And I'll tell another quick anecdote from a downstream initiative that we started, where we have a balloon for BAV prior to TAVR implantation. And we created a 2x2 matrix of price and volume, where we estimated our share of BAV balloons versus our price, and in a 4-blocker matrix. And so we identified who was high share, high price. We're not going to touch them, but who's low share, low price. And that helped direct the sales team on where to go, because we had sales in that account, but we could have gotten a lot more, or we could simply look at raising their price more to the national average. And so the tools are amazing. We have no reason to not use data. But back to your original question, if I were a startup, I'd get as hyper specific as possible and niche down to that ideal user who's going to be interested in my technology.
Yeah, and I think that's so. I mean, it seems so obvious, but so many companies don't do this. I think too many companies. Again, you sit in the seat. I don't. But like when it comes to like acquisition targets, I feel like what's more important is to be a very meaningful, specific for a niche market and have traction there, versus sort of being this wandering generality where it's like, oh, like we have these kind of physicians who use it for this use case, and I feel like too many med device companies take this like farmer approach, which they're trying to like be everything for anybody, and it's just the wrong idea.
Yeah, I would reference back to our Strabo acquisition in 2020. We knew that was a niche of the atherectomy market. And the peripheral atherectomy market is of sufficient size that if we could get 5, 10, 15% of that through a specific use case, we could be successful. And that's ultimately what we did. We didn't need to satisfy everybody, but we just needed to satisfy that mixed morphology, calcium thrombotic, in-stent restenosis patient. And physicians have really reacted well to that.
Yeah. And, Brent, I appreciate you spending some time with us. As we kind of wrap up, so I have a couple of interesting questions for you. Number one, what's for professional development career? Like, what are a couple of books that, I see you're a reader like me. What are some books that you like to recommend to people like coming up through the ranks? That's number one. So let's start there first, and then I'll ask you my second question.
Yeah, I'll say that two of my favorite books for leadership, the first is Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And then the second one, which is a bit of a sleeper, is Multipliers by Liz Wiseman.
You're the second person, Craig Gaffin, who's the president of Global Orthopedics at Smith & Nephew, was just on the show earlier today, and he mentioned Multipliers as well.
I've given that book out. I've led book clubs with it. It really changed as I was expanding my leadership scale, crossing that chasm, so to speak, between 5, 7, 14, 22. You can't be on everything, and you've got to create systems, a trusting relationship, and accountability. So Multipliers was a big one for me that I would highly recommend.
Love it. And then my last question too is that you had mentioned acute AMD, LSI, etc. But just for you in your personal / professional tech stack, what's your sort of daily tech stack that you like to use?
Yeah, I'm a novice at AI, so I can't say that I am getting behind anyone, but I'm open to ideas. I would say that my tech stack honestly starts with LinkedIn. I think that it's at a really interesting time where people are putting out great content. It's one of my market research tools when I'm looking for companies and what they're doing. In addition to Crunchbase and PitchBook, I use those as well. But I think LinkedIn can give you kind of that personal side of it. And I would say that. And then I think we met through LinkedIn. I can't complain about that, and great relationships and people that are super generous with time. So that would be my other piece of the tech stack.
I love it. No, I totally agree. I think LinkedIn is a big sleeper, but like I tell people that, LinkedIn was Microsoft's second largest acquisition in their history.
Yeah.
And so like that's for very, very good reason. So it's not going away. But well, Brent, look, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I'm going to tell the listeners, if you want, Brent is on LinkedIn and he is active. You can just look him up at Brent Lavin, spelled Lavin. So it's Brent Lavin MBA on LinkedIn. So be sure to connect with him. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, send this off to a MedTech professional, somebody in BD or marketing that can help them. And be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget, give us those 5 stars. We're the number one, show in the world for a reason, because of you, the listener. As always, I'm your host, Omar Khatib, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.